In today's lesson, we are graphing sine and cosine functions. So starting out with this sine function, we're just going to sketch the parent function, basically, of y equals sine of x, and then we'll do y equals cosine of x. And the points on the graphs are essentially coming from the unit circle, where x are going to be the radians, and then the y value on the function comes from the point that corresponds to the radian. So first with sine, it's that y value on the unit circle. So we'll have the point 0, 0, and then we'll have the point pi over 2, 1, and then the point pi 0, and the point 3 pi over 2, -1, and then we'll come back around to 2 pi back at 0. So the range of this function will be from 1 to -1. Domain is all real numbers, and what I'm going to do is put 4, so that's like the 4 corners of our unit circle. Okay, so I've got 0, 0, pi over 2, 1, pi 0, 3 pi over 2, -1, and 2 pi 0. Goes up, comes down. So that is kind of one period of the graph, but you can go around that circle an infinite amount of time, so it can keep going, following the same pattern. In this case, it's going to do this. Go in the other direction, it's going to go down, then back up. All right, and now for cosine, same idea, where the x value on the graph comes from these radians. So 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And then the y value is coming from the point here. So we've got 0, 1, pi over 2, 0, pi -1, 3 pi over 2 is 0, and then 2 pi is back to 1. Okay, so for cosine, I've got 0, 1, and then I'm going down, and then back up. So it looks a lot like sine. But there is one period, and again, this will continue in both directions. Like that. So there are the parent functions of sine and cosine, and then we are going to look at transformations of those parent functions. So now what we're going to do is take that parent function and add in all this extra stuff and see how it changes the graph. So we're going to start with amplitude, which is that coefficient out in front. So the amplitude, what it's going to do, it's going to stretch the graph vertically. So instead of maybe going from 1 to -1, it's going to change the range. Maybe it's going to go up to 3 and down to -3. Okay, so now period, it's coming from the letter B, but it's a little formula that we have to use B to find out. So period, that is saying like one time around that unit circle goes from 0 to 2 pi, and it creates this full graph. So the period could change where maybe you were going to create the full graph, but only from like 0 to pi. So we're going to kind of condense it horizontally, or possibly stretch it horizontally. So the normal period is 2 pi. So what we're going to do is to transform it, it's going to be 2 pi divided by the absolute value of whatever that b is. Now we're going to take that information and we're going to graph this function. We're going to graph y equals 3 sine of 2x. So starting out, let's deal with the fact that a equals 3. So we still have our midline that's right at the x-axis. We haven't shifted that at all. And instead of from 1 to -1, we're going to look from 3 to -3. So from the midline is up 3 or down 3. Okay, so now the period is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of this b value, 2. So that equals pi. So what I did, I quickly just sketched the parent function on here just to give you this visual. I always think about, I have to find like those 4 main points to make this full rotation from 0 to 2 pi. But now we want to do that full rotation from just 0 to pi. So I need those 4 marks just from 0 to pi. So let's erase that. And so here's pi. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to sine is still going to be at 0, 0. But now over just 1 unit here, pi over 4, it's going to go all the way up to 3. Hit 0 at pi over 2, -3, and then pi. And then that can continue. So it's going to go up, down, up. There's kind of one revolution, and then it's going to do that same thing every pi, because the period would be that length every time it just repeats that graph. Okay, so in the last slide, we were focusing on the A, amplitude, B, that changes the period, and now we're going to look at these phase shift and vertical shift, the C and the D. And just like all of our transformations this year, that number on the front is that vertical shift up or down, and then inside will be a horizontal shift left or right. Okay, so the vertical shift, the D at the end, what it does is it shifts the midline of the graph. And then the phase shift, so this negative is kind of that, it's always the opposite, right? Plus, we always think left, and minus, we go right. But because there's that coefficient in front of the x, you have to divide by that. So it's the opposite of C over the absolute value of B. So for our graph, first I'm just graphing the parent function, cosine of x, and then we're going to graph this. So the first thing I like to do is deal with the vertical shift, that midline. So on the parent function, the midline is the x-axis. We are shifting that midline up 3. Okay, so now there is no change in amplitude, so our graph is still just going to be up 1 and down 1. So there's kind of where the graph is going to lie. Okay, so because I have this b value, I have to deal with the period again. So that's the 2 pi divided by absolute value of 2. So in this case, once again, the period is changing to pi. And then the phase shift, that is negative pi over 2 divided by the absolute value of b, which is 2. That's the same thing as multiplying by 1/2. So negative pi over 4. Or in other words, this is going to shift left 4. Okay, similar to the last graph that had the period pi, and we always want those 1, 2, 3, kind of 4 special points. So if we're going to do this full rotation in the length from 0 to pi, we're going to go by pi over 4s. And then that's kind of nice because it's going to shift left pi over 4. Okay, so my 4 points, and really it's 5 points because of our starting one. So my starting one's going to be left pi over 4, and then I've got, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And cosine, so where it starts, it's starting up and then coming down and going back up. And then I can just continue that pattern. Okay, now we're going to do one more graph and we're going to put it all together. We're going to do a sine graph. So we're going to do y equals 4 sine of x over 2 minus pi over 4 minus 1. So in doing these, I always like to first look at the shift to find the midline, and then look at the amplitude to know how tall my graph is going to be. Okay, so the graph is completely blank, so it kind of leaves it open for you to label it however you need. I'm going to count, so like every 2 units is actually going to be 1. So that's 1, 2, -1, -2. Okay, so the vertical shift, the midline is down 1. So I will put a dotted line at -1. That's the magic line that cuts it in half. And now the amplitude is 4. So from the midline, I need to go up 4 and down 4. So I sometimes like to draw those solid lines to kind of just box my graph in, but you don't have to do that. Okay, so let's use all the information. We're going to need to find the period and the phase shift. So period is 2 pi divided by the absolute value of b. In this case, the b is 1/2. So 2 pi divided by 1/2 is the same as multiplying by 2. So it is 4 pi. And then the phase shift, so the opposite of c, so it's actually positive pi over 4. And then divided by b, which is 1/2. Dividing by 1/2 is the same as multiplying by 2. So 2 pi over 4 is pi over 2. Okay, so let's add on my graph. I'm going to label this x-axis. So all these, I'm going to label these all my pi. So pi, 2 pi, 3 pi, 4 pi, and so on. Now, it's going to take all the way from 0 to 4 pi. Well, the full length of the period is 4 pi. So actually, I'm going to sketch 2 graphs. I'm going to do one without the phase shift. So let's just start with, so this is sine. So I'm going to start here. And then at pi, I'm going to go all the way up. 2 pi, I'm coming back down. 3 pi, all the way down. 4 pi, back. So once again, this is without the phase shift. So there's that full rotation. But now to do the phase shift, it's you have to shift that right pi over 2. Pi over 2 is halfway to pi. So the halfway mark, I'm going to have to shift all of my points over pi over 2. So this phase shift can get quite complicated at times. This one, it turns out kind of nice. But we will practice that together in class. This is just to give you kind of the base information. So there is your full video on graphing sine and cosine functions. Good luck with the lesson.